If you're wondering why you're suddenly hearing about private equity all the time and what exactly it is, this episode is for you. My name is Brittany Page, and this is a special interview edition of the Page Perspective. We've talked a lot about private equity, specifically related to housing and the affordable housing crisis on this channel. We've talked about companies buying up single-family homes or apartment buildings, driving up rent prices, failing to keep buildings habitable while cashing rent checks, among many other things. But the deleterious effects of private equity go far beyond housing. That's why I am thrilled to talk to journalist and author Megan Greenwell, who wrote this important and incredible new book, Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. She tells the story of four people who have their lives upended by private equity across four different areas: media, retail, housing, and healthcare. At first, I was intimidated by this book because private equity somehow felt like a business slash financial topic that is outside of my area of expertise or even my familiarity. And if you feel the same way, just wait. Megan is going to blow your mind, illustrating how private equity threatens many of the institutions that help our communities survive and thrive, from housing to healthcare, and most importantly, what we can do about it. Megan's book is out now, and you can get it anywhere books are sold, or check the link in the description. And now, let's get into it. And now we are joined by Megan Greenwell, journalist and author. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.
So I was really intimidated to read your book because I hear about private equity all the time, and I know how important it is, particularly surrounding issues related to the affordable housing crisis. But I mean, private equity is everywhere. It's in the headlines. I even saw, I don't know if you saw the preview for the new movie, The Materialist, where Pedro Pascal plays a hot rich guy.
Yes.
What a stretch, but he's apparently in that movie in private equity. Even Taylor Swift was just in the headlines for private equity. I know that you posted on Blue Sky that reference in your intro is now dated because of that news. But for people who are watching this who may be confused like I was, what is private equity and why are we hearing so much about it?
Yeah, I think I really wrote this book for people who have some sense that private equity is important and that it's having some negative effects, but don't really know what that means. So I love starting there. Basically, private equity can mean a lot of different things, but the most common usage is talking about leveraged buyouts. And essentially what leveraged buyouts are if I'm a private equity firm, I pool money from outside investors, so pension funds, university endowments, ultra wealthy individuals, what have you. I pool all that money and combine it with bank loans to buy companies. Unlike venture capital, I'm not investing in those companies, I'm buying them outright, so then I control them. The trick with leveraged buyouts is a huge percentage of the money comes from those bank loans rather than from the money from outside investors. And if I buy your company as a private equity firm, I'm assigning the debt for those loans to your company, not to my firm. So if I drive your company into the ground, and a lot of these companies end up getting driven into the ground, I am not responsible for paying the money back. Only the company I've acquired is. So you end up with this weird kind of split in incentives where what's good for me as the private equity firm is not necessarily what's good for the portfolio company that I own, which is like kind of a twisted thing that doesn't really make sense under the laws of capitalism, but that's how it works. And that was why I was sort of unsettled by it and wanted to write a book about it.
Well, and you focus in the book on four areas where private equity has had a negative impact. You focus on media, you focus on housing, healthcare, and retail. What was it about those four areas that drew you in?
So I think they're four fairly representative industries for a couple of reasons. One is that they're all huge, right? The retail world is massive. The journalism world is getting smaller every day, but still like kind of a core part of our society. And housing and healthcare are things that we all need in our life, right? Um, and then the other thing that makes them representative, I think, is it shows sort of an evolution of private equity over time. Retail and media were very hot industries for private equity maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And so in those industries, private equity firms set a lot of the playbook for what they would use later in industries like housing and healthcare. So you can sort of see this growth over time, not just in terms of raw numbers, although there's plenty of that, but also in terms of like, okay, we've mastered this in local newspapers. Now let's expand it to something like housing, which, as much as I think media is important, messing with people's housing is even worse, right? Um, and so, yeah, it just felt like a good mix of industries that we all rely on, we all need in a functioning society, and that are being decimated by these private equity firms.
Yeah, when I was reading your book, again, because I don't know a ton about business and finances, and those topics are frankly intimidating to me. And I was more focused on the human element of the book, certainly, but you made it really accessible. And one thing that I thought of was Doge. Doge is almost like what private equity does to these companies is what Doge did to the government. Tell me if I'm right about that, right? Doge came in, they claimed that they were going to make the government more efficient. They destroyed agencies. They brought trauma to federal workers as promised by Project 2025. They made government less efficient, right? One of the main examples of that could be like Social Security Administration. And in the process, Elon Musk's government contracts, they weren't victims of that chainsaw. He was protected and all that. He's walking away unscathed, still a wealthy, comfortable man. How do you see that comparison? Am I on the right track?
Oh, I think it's so apt. When Doge first started really getting going, I was having a conversation with a former coworker. We worked together at a company that was taken over by a private equity firm, and she was covering Doge, and she was saying, it feels so similar because essentially what happened is all these guys start walking around your workplace. You've never seen them before, and they're issuing instructions that make zero sense because they haven't even taken the time to ask the questions about how does this work and how should this work, right?
Right.
And so, yes, it feels almost identical to me in some ways that are really eerie, and even more important because this is our entire government, right? But it's very much that same private equity ethos of, well, if it's not obvious to us right away what it does, we should just cut it. We shouldn't, demonstrate the curiosity to inquire why it might be necessary or what we can learn. We obviously know better, so we're just going to go in and slash everything to the ground.
And with no particular interest in making the companies profitable necessarily, because these private equity firms, they are perfectly fine. They do well. They benefit even when the companies that they take over go under. And I think that that's something that some people struggle to understand as well.
Yes, I think that's the first question I get from so many people is like, how does this even make sense? Because if your portfolio company isn't making money, surely you can't be making money. And yes, that would make sense if that was the way the system worked. But unfortunately, it's just not. So private equity firms use a payment structure they call 2 and 20. So they get a 2% management fee every year, 2% of the total deal, which might be a deal worth billions and billions of dollars every year. And that does not matter whether the company is succeeding or failing. The 20% is only a portion of profits, but you can define profits in so many creative ways that there are ways to capitalize on the 20% regardless of whether the company is actually succeeding. And then there are all of these tricks that private equity uses to make money off of their portfolio companies rather than making money for the companies. So, for example, they very frequently sell off the real estate of their portfolio companies. And that's something where, I sell the company's real estate. I pocket the proceeds. Now the company has to pay rent on the same land it once owned. And so the company is inherently weaker. Plus, they have to pay this massive interest on the debt that the private equity firm has acquired in their name. And so the result is you really do end up with this divorcing of incentives where what's good for me as the firm in charge is not necessarily what's good for the company I'm running. And I just think that's a really dangerous place to be because, you know, capitalism is one thing, but our understanding of free market capitalism means that I make money because I'm selling more things, you know, selling more goods, selling more services. And that's not what's happening in the private equity world.
Yeah, and it was scary to, I mean, read the examples that you talk about in media, healthcare, retail, and housing, because not only are they not necessarily concerned about whatever company or entity that they've taken over being profitable, but they don't care necessarily about the employees' well-being. They don't care about, you know, the tenants who live at the housing facilities that they are overseeing, how they're faring. So it really has these downstream effects where many people in these communities are negatively impacted by private equity taking over. And I guess if we can make that real for people, like talking about healthcare or housing, like you do in the book, what is an example of private equity coming in, taking over, and what are the effects in one of those areas?
Yeah, so I'll talk about housing and the story I focus on in the book. This is a huge apartment complex, close to 3,000 units in Northern Virginia, right outside DC. A huge percentage of the tenants there are African immigrants and people who are coming over newly, you know that this is a place you can go because you have friends or friends of friends who have lived in that same apartment building. And so for decades, the rent has been, below market value for that area. And that's worked out just fine for everybody involved. In 2020, that apartment complex got taken over by CIM Group, which is a private equity firm that's huge in residential real estate and particularly in apartments. And the rents went up, the services started getting slashed. So, as an example, people used to pay a flat fee for water. Um, and then the private equity firm started saying, okay, no, now you're going to pay for the amount of water. It's going to be broken down by the number of people in your apartment, right? So not by the amount of water you actually use, just by the number of people. So if you had a bigger family, you were paying $25 a month, a flat fee for water before. And now all of a sudden people were getting bills of several $100s a month, even when everybody in the family was gone all day, right? Their water usage was pretty minimal. And meanwhile, they're getting rent increases. And then all these things start going wrong with the building, right? So the air conditioning doesn't work. There's mold creeping up the walls of the air conditioning units, and kids are getting sick from it. There was a catastrophic flood that forced 14 families out of their apartments, and the landlord just didn't do anything about it. And so the woman I focus on in that section of the book was the one who most clearly said, look, I'm not going to stand for this. And she really fought back. But the reason I think the fact that so many people in that complex were immigrants is so relevant is a lot of those people felt like they had absolutely no power to fight back, right? They were truly just trying to survive. They didn't necessarily speak super fluent English. They didn't necessarily have, totally steady job situations. The fact that they had a roof over their head at all was enough, and so they were going to focus on scraping and clawing just to get by. And the woman who's the protagonist of that section of the book, her name's Loren DePina. She's not an African immigrant, but her parents are. And she was very much like, look, I have more power here and I'm going to use it to stand up for my neighbors.
Yeah, that was a part of the book that was enraging, also moving. I mean, because you can feel the injustice and you can feel how this company is just like stepping on the throats of people who are not in a position to fight back. There is a
Mhm.
hopeful element though in the end of the book, and I definitely want to get to that, because as someone who can struggle with feeling hopeless sometimes in the current political climate, it was nice that you finished on a positive note. I do want to say I appreciate how you also would provide these statements that were from representatives of the private equity firms, like in the aftermath of chaos, where they would say that they had a central role in saving the institution or entity that they purchased, whether they would claim that they were ensuring healthcare access or protecting access to housing. And then you would cite actual research studies that have looked at whether or not, for example, healthcare improves when a private equity firm takes over a hospital. Were you surprised by any of those research findings? What did those research findings show?
So I sold the book proposal in 2022, and the amount of new research that has come out between now and then has really surprised me just because I kept getting more material, right? There were some questions like, does patient care improve or decline under private equity ownership? That when I originally started writing this book, we didn't know the answer to that. And then in late 2023, this huge study came out that got a ton of mainstream attention that made clear that it does get worse. And the researchers had some pretty innovative ways of actually teasing out the signal from the noise there, which was a challenge. That's why there hadn't been any big studies before this. But
Right.
the thing they focused on, which I think was really smart, was they looked specifically at the rate of preventable medical complications. And these are things that, like, in a modern day, well equipped hospital in a rich country should basically never happen, right? The only way for them to happen, for the most part, freak accidents happen, but for the most part, the only way for them to happen is staffing shortages, equipment shortages, or just improper training. And what they found was there was a statistically significant increase in all of these different types of preventable medical errors, which is, the researchers didn't draw specific conclusions about why, but it's pretty hard to imagine any reason for that except cutting budgets. And so that was the clarity of that study really surprised me, because for the first time I was able to point to something that said conclusively, yes, 1+1 is 2. I think we all had a sense that care was going to decline under private equity ownership, but nobody knew for sure. And then all of a sudden we did.
Yeah, so we're starting to see more evidence of it in healthcare. We obviously see evidence of it in housing, like you just talked about. And you talk a lot in the book about how it's not just trying to make a profit with these private equity companies, it's maximizing shareholder profit. And so, like in the healthcare example, you talk about the ways that they do that is just like straight up raising the prices of healthcare, cutting costs by laying a bunch of people off and downsizing. Those things seem to pretty straightforwardly have a negative impact on the types of care that you're going to receive, especially in the context of the book, because you focused on a rural area hospital in Wyoming.
Yeah, I really wanted to focus on rural medicine in particular because it is the classic situation where people just don't have that many options, right? In Riverton, Wyoming, the community I write about, the nearest hospital is 30 miles away, which is pretty far if you've just had a heart attack or something, not even to
Oh, yeah.
mention, Wyoming winters, right? So there are times that
Right.
this is through, they call it the Wind River Valley because it is so windy. And so if you're trying to get through and there's a blizzard going, you may just not get through. And so all of these folks who had gotten pregnant after their local hospital stripped away obstetrics facilities at their hospital, all of a sudden it was like, okay, just go 30 miles to have a baby. And if you have any complications, you probably can't get them dealt with there because the private equity firm owns that hospital as well. And so they still have OB, but they don't have the ability to do anything complicated. So what you ended up seeing was the number of medevac flights out of that county increased like 900%, because
Wow.
there were just no options. You had to go somewhere to get the healthcare services you needed. So, yes, rural healthcare has been a particularly lucrative target for private equity and a particularly destructive one for communities and people, which is why I felt really strongly about focusing on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a powerful example. I mean, like I said, it's a moving part of the book where you focus on four specific people in those four specific areas. And I mean, I got teary when like the baby was named after Liz. I wanted to like stand up and cheer when you wrote about Lauren, who gave the speech at the residents meeting and to the manager at Southern Towers. Like there were so many moments where I felt personally invested in the stories that were being told, because you can see these people and people or you can see them in yourself. You can really identify with them. And I think that's also why it was nice that you didn't end on a hopeless note. You ended on a hopeful note of community and how important these community members are in organizing other members of their community or taking actions to really give back and ensure that, there's going to be a hospital that can provide services in the community, for example. What did you learn watching these organizers work in their communities?
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for calling that out, because focusing on people was really the thing I wanted to do with this book, because I don't think you can get readers invested in big topics like this without getting them to care about people. And so
Yeah.
I talked to probably 200-ish different potential characters to settle on these four,
Oh,
because I
wow.
felt like I really needed the right four people. And these felt like the right four people for exactly the reason you mentioned. They're motivated to do something about it, right? They
Mhm.
are all really extraordinary people who I think readers are really going to love reading about, because they just have great stories. They're great talkers. And sitting with each of them for hours and days and weeks was just a really fun experience. But also, they're all like firecrackers. Like, they are not the kind of people who were going to take this lying down. And they all went to pretty great lengths through unions, through fighting for new legislation, through trying to build something from scratch, um, through standing in front of pension boards and saying, hey, consider no longer funding these private equity firms until they treat their workers better. All of these ways that the vast majority of people don't do themselves and don't even see happening in the world, but they're
Right.
out there. And I felt like it was really important to shine a light on what is going on out there, because it's just as much a part of the story as the destruction private equity has wrought. And I hope that some people, take some inspiration from this and do some activism of their own. And I do find these four people really inspiring in terms of like, when you feel hopeless, the best strategy is to do something to help other people, not to just throw up your hands.
Yeah, and I mean, hosting a political show for as long as I have, not just here on YouTube, but also a podcast, I hear from people a lot over many years. And especially with Trump coming on the scene, there's a lot of hopelessness out there. And
Yeah.
in reading this book, I mean, you can imagine this fight that people are up against with these multi-billion-dollar corporations. It's like, how can I, as just an individual, fight back against these people who have all the wealth and all the power? But you see through community organizing in the book how how you can make a difference as an individual. And so I am hopeful that people will read this book and see that as a reminder for the current political moment, even if we're not specifically talking about private equity, just in the political moment that we're in right now, how important that is, that sense of community. But you also spoke to the political issues here and how both Republicans and Democrats are complicit in failing to act here in the face of harms with private equity. You present ways that private equity lobbies against regulation, the millions that they're investing to fight rent control in California, for example, and how they benefit from things like the carried interest loophole. You do cite Elizabeth Warren and her Stop Wall Street Looting Act, but you also note it's difficult to get people on board with this. What is the answer here? How can we get meaningful change?
So I think it is difficult to imagine any, sort of fundamental change to the private equity system happening on the federal level. 88% of members of Congress and the Senate receive private equity donations. That's across both parties. And in many cycles, Democrats get more money than Republicans.
Disappointing.
Yes. I live in New York, and Chuck Schumer has, every cycle for the last many, has been the top or among the very top recipients of private equity money. So yeah, there's a lot of resistance. One interesting thing that is happening right now is that for the second time now, Donald Trump has said he wants to see the carried interest loophole closed. And I actually wonder if Trump's sort of unique cult leader type status will end up being the thing that gets that closed, because, it's so the last several presidents, Trump, Obama, Biden, even before that, have said they want to see the carried loophole interest closed, but nobody in Congress falls in line because they're too beholden to private equity interests. Trump is a different kind of figure, and particularly in this term. And I don't think anybody was really expecting him to say, I want to see the carried interest loophole closed again in this term. But he did. And I do wonder if this is the thing that actually gets it closed, because so many Republicans are more afraid of him than they are of the private equity lobby, potentially.
Yeah.
So that could happen. The other thing that I think is really significant is there is a lot happening on the state level. Both Massachusetts recently passed a bill regulating private equity in healthcare, and Pennsylvania is now considering a very similar bill. Both of those grew out of major private equity disasters in healthcare, where a bunch of hospitals that people relied on closed. And that tends to be the moment where you start to see movement, is politicians feel pressured to do something because some catastrophe has occurred. So there is a lot of that bubbling up, and I think it does really speak to the importance of people have to pay attention to what's happening on their state and local level, not just the federal level. And in a lot of cases, there is more energy for things like regulating private equity there than there is on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I am nervous when things are up to Trump because he says a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that since you're the expert on it, I trust you and what you say there. But I'm nervous when it comes to, is Trump going to do something right and also potentially beneficial for the poor and working class? It makes me nervous.
No, absolutely. And I think, he has positioned it as a fairness thing, which is so interesting because in so many other ways, he wants to go to bat for big finance, right? Like that's sort of a core part of what he's doing, even as that is for some reason appealing to so many lower and lower middle class folks. That said, he has brought it up just consistently. So I'm certainly not promising anything, but it is really interesting to me. I think basically he wants to close the loophole to generate more money to replace the tax cuts he's going to give to rich people. So it's like, there's always a
Yeah,
push-pull when you're talking about him. But
sure.
I I do wonder if his, unique status as this figurehead, he seems not to have lost interest in closing this loophole. He's brought it up a couple of times this year already. It could just be the thing.
Yeah, I mean, and if we can wake people up to class consciousness, which I think your book has the potential to do if everyone reads it. Hint, hint. But I also was just thinking about the part in your book where the doctor Roger, and you describe him as a liberal in kind of the sea of red. And when it comes to the after portion of the book, and he's actually trying to get people on board with raising money and getting the new hospital built, and he actually works in conjunction with a Trump supporter. And you note how that helps him get buy-in with the community, but also in that is recognizing that it's not just like a liberal who's concerned about private equity and the harms and damages associated with it. It's also people that are Republican who are concerned about that. And so if people out in the world are recognizing the harms of private equity, regardless of their political affiliation, I guess the hope being that we can get to a point where those people then start pressuring their elected officials, regardless of party, and we can start seeing some sort of change.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think healthcare and private equity is one of those arenas in which class solidarity for so many people ends up outweighing political parties. Roger is a Democrat in Wyoming, which is one of the reddest states in the country, and this is one of the reddest counties in Wyoming. So basically, everybody he's working with to fight back against this private equity firm, with one exception, is a Republican, and like a very Trumpy Republican. And they're also so furious about losing this hospital, and so furious about the idea that it is a fancy Wall Street firm thousands of miles away from where they live, that is, these executives have never set foot in the community where they live. And they just, don't want to stand it. So these are not people who are supportive of Medicare for all, right? Like, this is not, there are real limits to what they see as the solutions, but what they see as the problem is pretty similar across party lines. I'm in a Facebook group of doctors who are upset about private equity getting involved in healthcare generally, and they cannot agree on solutions at all. A lot of them think unions are the devil, much less Medicare for all, right? So, but they all agree that they have to get private equity out of healthcare. So there is something super encouraging to me about that, in part because we do live in a very polarized time, and it does feel most of the time like Trump supporters and the rest of us can't really agree on basic facts. And in this case, these are people linking arm in arm and saying, no, we have to do something about this, which is like cool to see.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, another thing to feel hopeful about.
Yes, totally.
Well, like I said, I love this book. I learned so much from it. I have, all kinds of notes. This is going to be something that I reference on an ongoing basis. I learned so much from it. I'm so grateful that you wrote it. I hope the audience checks it out. It comes out June 10th today, and it will be linked in the description below. But there's one final question that I want to ask you, Megan, before you go. And I ask it at the end of all of my interviews in an effort to encourage the audience to change their minds as their understanding of evidence changes, or as the evidence changes. So in the spirit of that, Megan, I would like to ask you, what is the most recent thing you've changed your mind about?
Okay, I'm going to give you a serious one and a fun one. The serious one, which is directly related to the book, is when it comes to private equity in housing, a lot of progressives have said, look, yes, sure, we don't want private equity in housing, but they're not the real problem. The housing crisis is caused solely by supply issues, right? And for a long time, that argument was fairly convincing to me. I was writing
Mm-hmm.
about the evils of private equity in housing, but I also really wanted to be careful to say, they didn't cause the housing crisis. I do still believe that private equity did not cause the housing crisis, but there has been more and more research. Even over the last couple of months, there have been like a couple of big projects, one from the private equity stakeholder project, which just does amazing research that have shown that yes, maybe private equity didn't cause this housing crisis, but they are exacerbating it in very serious ways. So they looked at the increase in rent and the increase in the share of people paying too much of their income in rent in various cities. And they found that as the number of private equity owned apartments goes up, the number of people paying way, way, way too much of their income on rent goes up significantly. So I changed my mind on, like, I actually think private equity is more culpable than I originally thought, even having written a book about private equity being culpable for damage in this arena.
Wow.
So yeah, that was a big one to me. And then my silly one, I for my entire life, I've really hated scallops, the like seafood.
Yeah.
And I recently had them raw for the first time, and I was like, wait,
Oh,
these are really good. And so now I know that I like scallops raw, but just not cooked. So
interesting.
yes, we're all trying new things here.
It seems like it would be the other way around, that people
I
would struggle
know.
more with the raw scallop than the cooked
I
scallop.
know. There's something about the texture of cooked that I just can't do, but they're so like sweet and briny raw. And I was like, oh, these are great. I've been missing out.
What about like a smoked scallop?
Ooh, no, no.
Okay, too much, too much.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I love that. Again, in the first one, I mean, both of them really, it's an example of how we need to keep updating our views on things, right? I always talk about being a lifelong learner and how, learning is not ever over. I mean, it can be if you want it to be, but it shouldn't be. And
Yeah.
hopefully it's not for a lot of people because, like you said, even after you wrote this book, you're still learning more about private equity. You're still keeping up with the new research. So that's awesome.
Yeah. No, Brian Goldstone, who I know you've had on your show too.
Yeah.
Um, I went to one of his book events and he was talking about how people are often forced out of their private equity owned housing in Atlanta. And then when they get pushed into extended stay motels, those are
Mm-hmm.
also owned by private equity firms. And that was something that I didn't know after completing my book. I learned from Brian. And so I really love, the best part of my job to me is getting to be in community with all of these people doing the work on different topics and learning so much from them. So yeah, and thank you for being out there doing the work.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And thank you again for writing it. I hope everyone takes the time to buy it and read it. It's really important. And thank you so much for being here, Megan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brittany. This was a fun conversation.